Welcome back. It's chapter 6, the first part thereof. We're going to go over the human body, starting from the outermost, biggest size down to the granular. And in the spirit of ABCs, we're going to start with respiratory and go cardiac, muscular, skeletal, fascial, nervous system. We'll take a break then and complete the rest of the body systems in the second part of this chapter's lecture series. It's a big chapter. We cover a lot of the body essentially, and we get pretty deep. So buckle in, but I'm going to keep it fun. There he is, the old Vitruvian man. That was a drawing by Da Vinci. Let's look at what we will cover in this lecture: anatomy and function or physiology of respiratory, cardiovascular, skeletal, connective, and the muscular and nervous systems. We will save these two for after this, unless we have a little bit of time we're flowing through, and we'll keep going. There's a little break there, but let's get deep. What do you say? So in ABCs, our first concern is always respiratory. A little bit more so cardiovascular nowadays. However, we should be looking at what the system is consisting of. There in the respiratory system is the upper and the lower respiratory system. The upper runs from the sinuses or the nasopharyngeal airway down past the soft palate into the oropharyngeal airway. That's called the upper airway. Then into the oral pharynx or the pharynx proper. You notice there's a hole that goes to another part of the body. That is the esophagus. We'll get to that later. Here's where we're headed. Right down the old trachea. And as we get past the voice box, we are then going from upper to lower airway. So you can see here our nasopharynx. Notice the concha in there. That's what spins your inhaled breath and moistens it, as well as flicks debris against the sinuses in order to filter out any big particulates, dusts, pollens, things of that nature. The soft palate is essentially a little soft tissue there that can flop and move around. We have a big tongue in children. The tongue and the epiglottis are larger in proportion to their bodies. The tongue, if the jaw is loose, can fall back against the back of the throat when you are completely unconscious. So we head tilt, chin lift to move the jaw forward and open the airway. As we lift and open the airway, you notice the larynx and the epiglottis, or the flap that covers the trachea whenever you swallow. The whole goal of the epiglottis is to prevent food and liquid from getting into the trachea and the upper airway. Try this. Put your head back and watch how the airway opens up from here to here. See the difference? The jaw goes out, moves away from the back of the throat. The oropharynx gets larger, and now you have a straight shot directly down into the trachea. Now try this. Try and breathe and swallow, and notice what happens the moment you swallow while you're breathing. Can't do it. It's a reflex, so that you don't swallow food or liquid and aspirate it or inhale it into your lungs. Sometimes you do, and you know what happens. You start coughing violently to get that out. That's important to keep in mind. We can take in external foods and drinks and bacteria and dirt, so long as it's not into the respiratory system, only if it gets into the digestive system. And then it's only safe if it's inside a closed, mucosally lined, highly acidic or alkaline digestive tract that keeps it isolated and keeps it moving through in a closed container in order to not allow it to get out and cause infection anywhere else. We got stuff inside our lungs, within hours to days, we would have a raging infection, which is why it's important when people choke to have them go to the hospital afterwards, particularly children or people that have dementia or some kind of senility. They won't be able to give you a clear story as to whether or not it feels like there's something inside of their lungs. And it can be a very small particle that could cause all the issues. Moving down the airway into the lower portion of the airway, we see the trachea, which some people call the windpipe. There's the larger cartilage called the thyroid cartilage, that all of these little pieces are kind of C-shaped, except for the thyroid and the cricoid, which are completely circumferential. The rest of these cartilaginous C-shaped pieces line the trachea and the bronchi and bronchioles as they descend and get smaller into the respiratory system. The cartilage is what allows these tubes to stay open when you inhale and create negative pressure in the lungs. It's very important. As we go through this, we're going to start big and get small. As the main stem trachea branches to the right and left main stem bronchi, we continue to get smaller. The bronchi get smaller and become bronchioles. Whenever you see IOLES, it indicates a smaller version of something. We have venules, we have arterioles, and we have bronchioles. And as we branch down the bronchial tree, we get down finally to the smallest layer, the alveoli. This is the alveolar sac. And around this little grapeseed air-inflated lung tissue is capillary beds. Blood is running from the heart through here and diffusing carbon dioxide into the alveolar sac. And as you inhale, the oxygen is diffusing from inside the alveolar sac onto the pulmonary veins, which are making their way back up to the heart. And then to the left side, that will then be pumped out to the body. But that's for the cardiovascular systems chapter. Right here, understand all of the diffusion of gases takes place only at the very smallest terminus of the bronchioles. That would be the alveoli. Very important. Another important thing to understand is when you inhale, it's active. That's when we activate the most muscles. And we are creating a negative pressure in the lungs in order to suck air in from the outside. That creates a negative pressure. And the only way those tubes or bronchi or bronchioles can stay open is if they are reinforced by rigid rings around them, hence the cartilage. In expiration, we're creating a positive pressure in the chest and ejecting out our air that's inside there. In and out, in and out.
Normal breathing relies on air moving into and out of the lungs through the respiratory system, driven by a pressure gradient created by the elastic forces from movement of the respiratory muscles of the chest wall and of the diaphragm. Most work is done by the diaphragm, though during exercise or respiratory distress, the muscles of the chest wall, the external intercostal muscles and accessory muscles of breathing also contribute. On inspiration, the diaphragm moves down and the respiratory muscles contract to expand the chest such that air comes rushing into the airways, bronchi, bronchioles, and finally into the alveoli for gas exchange. Expiration is a comparatively passive process, driven by elastic recoil within the lungs and diaphragm, though when ventilation is increased, for example during exercise, the intercostal and abdominal muscles also contribute. The resting position for the lung is at the end of expiration. The graph of intrapleural pressure plotted against lung volume can be useful to help understand the relationship between the pressure changes in the respiratory system and lung volume. The graph shows that as the pressure gets increasingly negative, as the diaphragm moves down and respiratory muscles pull outward on the chest wall, air enters the lung and lung volume increases. The same happens in reverse on expiration. Lung volume decreases as the pressure becomes less negative and air flows out of the lungs. This is an important concept to understand when considering mechanical ventilation, which is positive pressure ventilation. So instead of air being sucked in down a pressure gradient, it is blown in under positive pressure.
Questions will be answered in lecture and the class. Circular or cardiovascular system. Circulatory or cardiovascular. That includes all this stuff, the heart, the blood vessels, the arteries, the arterioles, the capillaries, the venules, and the veins. In order from blood delivery, it goes arteries. Only that says arteries. Pay no attention to that. Arterioles, capillaries, capillary beds, in other words, like the ones around the alveoli, collecting to the venules, collecting the venules to the veins, and then to the right side of the heart. So let's take the upper chambers. Here's chamber 1, and there's chamber 2. These collectively are the atria, right and left atrium. The atria contract simultaneously. They're moving blood in different places. However, they beat at the same time, roughly. They are the upper chambers. The lower chambers are the right and the left ventricles. The atria pump blood into the ventricles. The ventricles contract simultaneously. So as we would look at a heartbeat, it would be atrial contraction, ventricular contraction, or lub-dub, lub-dub. Atria contract, thrusting blood into the ventricles contract, sending blood to the outside the heart to different parts of the body. Where do they go? Well, it's important, but hang on. You also have to realize that this isn't possible without one-way valves placed in key points inside the heart's anatomy. The AV valves, or the atrioventricular valves, conveniently sit between the atria and the ventricles, and we have 2 of them. We have the right-sided and we have the left-sided. The right-sided has 3 sails or cusps, and we call it the tricuspid valve on the right side. They act like sails, and rather than catching wind to inflate, when the ventricle contracts, the pressure of the blood inside the ventricle inflates the valve and closes it, like the valve in Cloud City that closes as Luke's trying to climb back up. Boop, it closes up. There's nobody getting back up. We're not getting any regurgitated blood into the atria. It stays in the ventricle, and it is then thrust out the semilunar valves, the valves that run to the lungs, or the aortic valve that runs to the rest of the body. When the atria contract, these AV valves close, and the semilunar valves that run to the lungs and the aorta close. In case you didn't know, and this is probably new to you, lub-dub sounds that you are familiar with hearing when someone tries to reproduce the heart is the sounds of the valves closing, not the contracting chambers. You're hearing the valves snap shut, snap, lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. When you hear the lub, it's the the semilunar valves. When you hear the dub, it's the AV valves closing. We have several pulses as EMTs that we take a look at and feel for always. The carotids, to check and see if they're alive or dead. The femoral pulses, which are checked during CPR to ensure we're getting good perfusion. And of course, the radials, when we're assessing patient's pulse, who's conscious, in other words, seems stable. There are other ones like the pedal pulses, which we check if there are any injuries to the lower part of the body, but typically the big three are those that we just saw. Meanwhile, if we look at the cardiovascular system, we have three types of tubes or vessels. We have the arteries that leave the heart directly from the heart. They are the highest pressure. They are sending blood out to the rest of the body or to the lungs. They get smaller and become arterioles at some point, and those arterioles eventually turn into bed finger-like projections that go and surround cells and tissue, and we call those the capillaries or capillary beds. By the time they get to the capillary beds, all of this big gout of different cells and tissue is running in a one-way, one cell at a time direction through. The capillaries collect on the other side in a thin-walled venule that then, from being the most branched out, start to get larger, and they culminate into venules, to larger veins, and the veins collect into the upper or lower vena cava. We also call that the superior or inferior vena cava, and the vena cava collects at the right atrium to be pumped out to the rest of the heart and go through that cycle again. Inside the blood itself, we have certain components. Plasma is the fluid of which the blood flows through. It is considered a tissue, just like muscular tissue or skin. It is a fluid tissue, and it consists mostly of water and proteins like albumin, which is an egg white. Keep that in mind for later in the lecture. We have red blood cells, or these jelly donut-shaped cells, also called erythrocytes, which are predominantly for carrying oxygen. They have a protein lining on their outsides that has little receptors called, what are they? Little receptors called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin binds to oxygen. It can also be bound to carbon monoxide, and it can also be bound to cyanide. So we don't want that to happen. But those receptors, for the most part, in a healthy environment with a healthy person, are binding to oxygen and carrying that oxygen through the body to deliver, once they get to the capillary beds, to the cells in that area. There are white blood cells. There are a number of white blood cells that do your body's infection fighting and immunoresponses. Some of them explode upon contact with a foreign substance. Some of them eat the substance. It depends on the cell type, and it depends on what the antibody is that it's attacking, as well as where in the inflammatory or the immune cycle that white blood cell is in. Then we have these little, once started as red blood cells, but fragmentary pieces of the cells that then specialize and become platelets. Platelets will react when there is a tear inside the blood vessels or it comes into contact with oxygen. They become spiny. Those spines on them open up, and they are like burrs that will attach to one another around the broken portion of the blood vessel. Then other cells begin to stick to that spot, and we get tiny microscopic scabs or clots. That, together with some hormones that are produced during a clotting cycle, is what allows our body to fix major leaks and blood leaks from tissues and from blood vessels. It can also be overactive, and it can happen to a point where they're too big of a clot, which now causes issues for the body. Okay.
The heart pumps blood throughout the body. carrying oxygen and nutrients to every cell. It's this circulation of blood that is vital, sustaining life. The heart is an organ made up of several tough layers of muscle. The pericardium is the thin layer that covers the exterior, while the endocardium lines the inside walls. The heart is divided into 4 chambers, 2 upper and 2 lower. The upper chambers, known as the atrium, receive blood coming into the heart. The lower chambers are the ventricles that pump blood out. Between each chamber are valves that open and close and help keep the blood moving. They are the tricuspid, mitral, pulmonary, and aortic valves. A pumping cycle starts when oxygen-depleted blood returns to the heart after circulating throughout the body. The blood enters through the right atrium before flowing to the right ventricle. It's then pumped to the lungs via the pulmonary arteries. There, blood is rejuvenated by air that's breathed in. The oxygen-rich blood returns to the heart through the left atrium, where it goes to the left ventricle. Then, by way of the aorta artery, the fresh blood is pumped throughout the body before the process repeats itself. That process happens with every heartbeat, and it's relentless. The heart beats 100,000 times a day, 40 million times a year, and up to 3 billion times over an average lifespan. But there are conditions that can disrupt a heartbeat and that normality. They can range from myocardial infarction or a heart attack to heart disease and hypertension. In contrast, exercise and emotional excitement can also have an impact on a person's heartbeat. The various blood vessels that comprise the circulatory system are a network of veins, arteries, and capillaries that span over 60,000 miles throughout the body, and the heart is the pump at the center of it.
It's quite amazing. It's the size of your fist, and that runs for the length of your life. A lot of blood will bathe that heart, by the way, which is not mentioned yet, but the cardiovascular system. We also must consider the coronary arteries that feed the heart. More on that when we get to cardiac issues and abnormalities. The skeletal system. How many bones do we have in our bodies? Anyone know? 206 typically. Some people have 1 or 2 more, or some people have fused bones that have become unfused, and thus they consider them movable, but give or take 206 is fine for us. We are going to look at the different setup of those bones and how they connect and how they move. Their main reasons for existing is support, so that the scaffold can then build the rest of the tissue off of that. Of course, protection of the vital organs, particularly the lungs and the genitals, lungs and the large vessels in the thoracic cavity, genitals, blood vessels inside the pelvic girdle. And then in the case of the long bones, red blood cell production occurs within the bone fat, or what we call the marrow. That's called hematopoiesis. Let's look at some types of bones. We have the irregular bones, like the facial bones, zygoma, the maxilla, the zygomatic bone, the lacrimal bone. These are all very strange. Only 2 or maybe even 1 bone that looks like that in the body. These are considered irregulars. The bones that run across the head in infancy and early childhood are unfused. As you get older, the joints between the bones become immovable, and you fuse your bones together. Our back consists of 33 sets of bones. We have 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 5 coccygeal. So there's the first 7 that we call cervical. we typically will call shorthand when we are immobilizing someone to a backboard. We call that C-spining. What we're saying is not only are we going to secure their neck, but their whole back will be C-spined, but it means we will spinally immobilize a patient to a backboard. There are 12 thoracic, think 12 ribs, 12 thoracic vertebrae. Shoot. 5 lower lumbar. These also are damaged because they're highly mobile. 5 sacral fused to the pelvis, and 5 coccygeal or our tailbone vertebrae. The part of the arms that extend off of our main skull and rib cage and back is called the appendicular skeleton. Arms, legs, sides of pelvis. If you look closer at the rib cage, we have the sternal notch at the top. It's kind of a little cleft that you can feel. The first portion of the ribs is a different angle called the manubrium. Then you have the actual body of the vertebrae or of the sternum. And below that is a triangular piece that sticks off, known as the xiphoid process. If you look at your bones on the costal muscles, 1 through 7 attach directly to the sternum. 8, 9, 10, 11 attach to themselves, which attach to the sternum. And then you have 2 floating ribs, I should say, 8, 9, and 10, and 11 and 12 are the floating ribs that do not attach to anything. But if you were to look what they cover behind the abdomen, they cover the kidneys, retroperitoneal kidneys sit back there. Here's your pelvic girdle. Of course, this is mostly rigid, but it can flex due to the symphysis pubis and some of the joints along the sacrum. When there's a release of a hormone known as elastin, they can become more flexible to encourage easier childbirth. But they're the link of the upper body to the lower portion, and they protect the reproductive organs. If you look at the lower part of the legs, the iliacs or the ilium or ilia together move down, and there's a little hole there. There's a kind of a bowl-shaped joint. It's a ball and socket joint known as the acetabulum, and that's where the thigh bone or the femur head attaches. There is always cartilage between 2 bones in a healthy system if those 2 bones are meant to move. We call movement of bones articulation. There's a little bit of a bursal sac in there with synovial fluid to lubricate and allow for better articulation of the ball and socket joint. Then we move down the arm of the femur, down the shaft of the femur. Again, femur is a big place where hematopoiesis occurs. Down to the patella or the kneecap, to the tibia and the fibula. The tibia is the larger one. The fibula is the smaller posterior portion. The patella covers that knee joint, and then follow down the 2 tibia and fibula to the feet. We have the calcaneus on the other side, followed by the tarsals, the metatarsals, and the ends, the movable little toes that we call phalanges. We have joints, as I mentioned, that articulate bone. It's very important that we have joints between the sternum and the costals, because that's what allows your chest to expand and contract during respiration. It's important that we have movement in some joints where we need a lot of articulation. The ball and socket joints of the shoulder and the hip are very important for the type of movements that we need to do in order to exist in our space. Then there are other areas where we want a lot of strength and don't require a lot of movement. We would rely on a hinge joint like in the elbow and knee. And there are other joints that occur in the thumb, in the jaw, saddle joints, and semi-movable joints. As I mentioned, when there's a need for the pelvis to move and flex, we can loosen that up with certain hormone releases. But there's always in that joint, if it's to be movable, there must be cartilage. If bone touches bone, it will fuse together in a matter of hours. And if it's not continually broken up, that bone fusing will occur and become very, very difficult to break up and eventually permanent. So every joint must have some kind of cartilage to shock absorb, to keep away the tendency to fuse, and to lubricate and move around. There is some synovial fluid floating through there. Here's a nice movement of the shoulder, I believe. Looks like this is the back scapula. There's the clavicle in the front. And what allows the movement of those joints? Well, of course, the muscular system. The muscles provide the strength and the ability to have local motion. Muscles also supply support and allow movement. But what else do they do? Muscles also can create heat and keep a person warm if you're warm-blooded. What we're talking about in those cases are the striated muscles that cover the skeleton. We also call them the skeletal muscles. Smooth muscles, on the other hand, are what encircle or are inside the involuntary organs of our body. We have smooth muscle that wrap around our bronchial tree. Smooth muscle surrounds our blood vessels. Smooth muscles run down through the digestive tract. And so they will respond by creating wave-like movement to move things through, like blood or food, and that is called peristalsis. And then there's a third muscle called the cardiac muscle, which by and large is an involuntary muscle, but because of its strength and usage, it is in the shape and very much in the strength of your skeletal muscles. But it is innervated by different nerves of the autonomic nervous system that will allow it to speed up and slow down according to involuntary stimuli. We can do it to a certain extent as well by putting ourselves into a system of exertion or a nervous condition. But for the most part, it is controlled involuntarily. Okay, we will watch that later. It's the movement of muscle, which relies on this fibrin strength of gravity.
You use muscles every day to do activities. This woman is using muscles to breathe, circulate blood, and move her hand to take notes. Your cardiac and smooth muscle tissues are involuntary. You do not consciously control their actions. Skeletal muscle works under voluntary control. Skeletal muscles are composed of bundles of muscle fibers. Muscle fibers are long cylindrical cells containing several nuclei. Muscles will contract or relax when they receive signals from the nervous system. A neuromuscular junction is the site of the signal exchange. This is where the synaptic bulb of an axon terminal and muscle fiber connect. Muscle fibers are composed of many myofibrils. A myofibril contains contractile units called sarcomeres. Sarcomeres run adjacent to one another down the length of the myofibril. Each sarcomere consists of alternating thick and thin protein filaments, giving skeletal muscle its striated appearance. The muscle contracts when these filaments slide past each other. The thick filaments are myosin, which are anchored at the center of the sarcomere, called the M line. The thin filaments are composed of the protein actin, which are anchored to the Z lines on the outer edges of the sarcomere. Because the actin filaments are anchored to the Z lines, the sarcomere shortens from both sides when actin filaments slide along the myosin filaments. Although the action between the filaments is described as sliding, the myosin filament actually pulls the actin along its length. The cross bridges of the myosin filaments attach to the actin filaments and exert force on them to move. This action is known as the sliding filament mechanism of muscle contraction. In this model, the sarcomeres shorten without the thick or thin filaments changing in length. A contraction begins when a bound ATP is hydrolyzed to ADP and inorganic phosphate. This causes the myosin head to extend and can attach to a binding site on actin, forming a cross bridge. An action called the power stroke is triggered, allowing myosin to pull the actin filament toward the M line, thereby shortening the sarcomere. ADP and inorganic phosphate are released during the power stroke. The myosin remains attached to actin until a new molecule of ATP binds, freeing the myosin to either go through another cycle of binding and more contraction or remain unattached to allow the muscle to relax. Muscle contractions are controlled by the actions of calcium. The thin actin filaments are associated with regulatory proteins called troponin and tropomyosin. When a muscle is relaxed, tropomyosin blocks the cross-bridge binding sites on actin. When calcium ion levels are high enough and ATP is present, calcium ions bind to the troponin, which displaces tropomyosin, exposing the myosin binding sites on actin. This allows myosin to attach to a binding site on actin, forming a cross bridge. Calcium ions are stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum and are released in response to signals from the nervous system to contract. Neurotransmitter molecules are released from a neuron and bind to receptors, which depolarizes the membrane of the muscle fiber. The electrical impulse travels down the T tubules and opens calcium stores. Calcium ions flow to the myofibrils, where they trigger a muscle contraction. As the actin and myosin slide along each other, the entire sarcomere shortens as the Z lines draw closer to the M line. As the sarcomeres in myofibrils contract, the entire muscle fiber will shorten. When muscle fibers contract in unison, a muscle can produce enough force to move the body, allowing you to take notes.
What a tremendous amount of
When it comes to a muscle, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about what happens at the
what a tremendous amount of things occurring at one time to simply do this. Happening close to the speed of light, not that fast, nearly, and yet still so fast that we consider fast twitch to be instantaneous. It's extraordinary. It truly is extraordinary. To me, there's a new forefront of medicine. Some of them would say it's the mesentery system. Another forefront in medicine is fascia and connective tissue. It's everything between all of the stuff. It's what surrounds us and binds us together. If you won't get angry for another Star Wars quote. Look at here and see the different layers of fascia that connect everything together. And yet at the same time, separate out layers of brain tissue, layers of skin tissue. If you look on the outside of a chicken breast, that shininess is a small layer of fascia that covers that. It keeps it all in one spot and allows for movement of tissues around it. It's profoundly important, and yet it has remained unstudied for many, many, many years. I think this is going to be a giant step forward when we start studying fascia and the connective tissue. So if you look and see all of the layers between the meninges are indeed fascial layers. We have to see between the different striations of muscle and the fibers, including even the fibers that we were just examining of the fibrin and the sarcomeres, there is little fascial layers that completely surround everything. And nowadays, the big step forward in connective tissue is, are we flossing nerves in and out of our connective tissue? Are we moving our joints and our bones in such a way that will break the connective tissue up. Another step in doing so is drinking warm saline water or salt water in the morning in an effort to create some movement of fluid through the fascial linings and loosen up a person. Very interesting stuff. This is where stuff collects. This is indeed where there would be waste products that build up and will not be drained when you're dealing with lymph concerns. This is where tumor cells will nest and remain unmanageable, but still have one or two hiding in there so that years later, those develop back into tumors. The fascia is a profoundly important part of what we do and remains very unstudied. I think that will be, as I mentioned, important in the future. Let's look at something that we've been trying to study since the beginning of mankind's interest in medicine. And we're pretty much not much closer to understanding it than we were 300 years ago. The nervous system. It consists anatomically of the brain, the spinal cord, and all the nerves that innervate and run from those areas to the rest of the body, including cranial nerves. We have 12 of them. They run directly from the brain, that portion that's controlling them, to the portion of the body that are being controlled. They don't run down the spinal cord like other nerves. They run directly out and around to different portions. And they can be anything from the eyes, the mouth, the nose, the smell and sight, to the digestive system and the speeding and slowing down of breathing and heart rate. In this situation, we have motor and sensory nerves. Sensory nerves bring the sensor, the impulse from the outer body nerves up to the brain for processing, or in some cases to a synapse, a shortcut in the spine. Let's say if it's a particularly painful or hot stimuli, that signal only needs to get as far as the spinal cord until your body creates a reflex that's sent back down the motor nerves to remove your hand from whatever the painful stimuli was, making it up to the brain. In fact, if you've ever noticed, if you put your foot in hot water and you realize it's hot, your body pulls it out seconds before you actually feel the pain. You feel a kind of overwhelming neurologic sensation. Sometimes it almost feels cold. You take your foot out, and about a second later, you feel the throb of the heat. Same thing with being stuck by something. You take your hand away, then feel the pain. That is the signal making it only to the spinal cord, hitting the reflexive synapse, sending a signal to your motor arm to take it away before any more harm can be done. And then you're getting the echo of that signal, or the ripple effect of it getting to the brain and actually triggering the sensory pain response that would then initially have been when your hand was pulled away as a child. It's very interesting. The brain's the central computer. It involves thinking, voluntary actions. As you go deeper down into the brain, involuntary functions and emotions and urges live down in those areas. You branch up towards the surface, you get into the cerebrum, which is all of our higher thinking, our speech, our reasoning, and body movements and so forth. Back in the area of the cerebellum, we have control of movement and balance. And the spinal cord, midbrain, is where we have involuntary muscles, movement, and stimulus. Let's take a break. What do you say? Okay. We're going to take a small break. Now, you can stop there, or you can continue on if you'd like. Here we are into the second half of the lecture, the digestive system. This is where the food that we take in from the outside environment is broken down to a micro layer to get energy from as we burn it in our body's metabolism. This is also where food comes in to be processed, and the waste product is ejected later on through our colon. This is all occurring in the lower part of the body, below the ribs, in the peritoneal sac, where our digestive organs live. You swallow food, as we mentioned before, and it travels not down into the trachea, but because thankfully the epiglottis closes over our trachea, the food makes its way back down the esophagus by way of peristalsis. It makes it into the stomach. Stomach has gastric juices, which begin to break it down. It leaves the stomach at the duodenum and enters the small intestine. As it enters the small intestine, it begins absorbing, and your body adds digestive juices and hormones to it. So you get gall, you get insulin, you get different digestive juices that mix and will now allow not just the breakdowns of proteins and sugars and carbs, but fats as well. And it will travel from the stomach through the duodenum into the small intestine, where it spends the majority of the time being slurried and mixed and squished about and sitting and allowing the juices to break it down. And in that area, there are blood vessels that bring that food product nutrients into the liver for processing into different parts of the body to start being used as energy. As it travels through here, as I said, mixes with the different juices created by the pancreas and the gallbladder, and it travels through the small intestine until it gets to the lower right side of the abdomen, and the food eventually travels into the large intestine. The large intestine is much shorter, but much bigger. And the main job of the large intestine is to reabsorb the majority of the fluid that has been swallowed and mixed up. As it travels through the colon, it goes up the ascending right side of the colon of the body, across the transverse colon, and down the left descending colon to finally down into the rectum, where there's the anal sphincter, and it is released, hopefully, when there is a place for it to go. So we're watching it travel from throat to esophagus to small intestine, large intestine to rectum, get to finally the end. There are 3 other organs that I've mentioned. These are the ones that allow for you to mix up juices, and those juices are for breaking down different food products.
The gut is often the body's first point of contact with microbes. Every mouthful of food is accompanied by a cargo of microorganisms that go on to encounter the mucosa, the innermost layer of the gut. Most microbes are destroyed by the harsh acidic environment in the stomach, but a hardy few make it through to the intestine. The intestinal surface is covered with finger-like protrusions called villi, whose primary function is the absorption of nutrients. However, these structures and the underlying tissues also host the body's largest population of immune cells. Scattered along the intestinal mucosa are dome-like structures called Peyer's patches. These are enriched in lymphoid tissue, making them key sites for coordinating immune responses to pathogens whilst promoting tolerance to harmless microbes and food. The villi contain a network of blood vessels to transport nutrients from food to the rest of the body. Lymphatics from both the Peyer's patches and villi drain into the mesenteric lymph node. Within the villi is a network of loose connective tissue called the lamina propria, and at the base of the villi are the crypts, which host stem cells that replenish the epithelium. Finally, the epithelium, together with its thick overlying mucus, forms an important barrier against microbial invasion. Embedded within the matrix of the Peyer's patch is a mix of immune cells, including T and B lymphocytes, macrophages, and dendritic cells. A key function of the Peyer's patch is the sampling of antigens, in this case, mostly bacteria and bits of food. To facilitate this, the Peyer's patch has a much thinner mucus layer as well as specialized phagocytic cells called M cells, which can transport material across the epithelial barrier via a process called transcytosis. Finally, dendritic cells are able to extend dendrites between epithelial cells to sample antigens that are then broken down and used for presenting to lymphocytes. Sampling antigens in this way typically results in so-called tolerogenic activation, where the immune system initiates an anti-inflammatory response. With their cargo of antigen, these dendritic cells then traffic to the T cell zones of the Peyer's patch. Upon encounter with specific T cells, the dendritic cells convert them into an immunomodulatory cell called a regulatory T cell, or Treg. Defects in the function of these cells are associated with inflammatory bowel disease in both.
By the way, you don't need to know all the intricacies of this in EMT. Paramedic, you will. Nursing, you will. Certainly in medical school. For now, enjoy the immunoresponse cycle that they're showing you. And stay in awe like I am for the most part.
And humans. These Tregs then migrate to the lamina propria of the villi via the lymphatics. Here, the Tregs secrete a molecule called IL-10, which exerts a suppressive action on immune cells within the lamina propria and upon the epithelial layer itself. IL-10 is therefore critical in maintaining immune quiescence and preventing unnecessary inflammation. However, a breakdown in this process of immune homeostasis results in gut pathology, and when this occurs over a prolonged period and in an uncontrolled manner, it can lead to inflammatory bowel disease. Chemical, mechanical, or pathogen-triggered barrier disruption coupled with particular genetic susceptibilities may all combine to set off inflammation. Epithelium coming into contact with bacteria is activated, leading to bacterial influx. Alarm molecules released by the epithelium activate immune cells, and Tregs in the vicinity scale down their IL-10 secretion to enable an immune response to proceed. Dendritic cells are also activated by this environment and start to release key inflammatory molecules such as IL-6, IL-12, and IL-23. Effector T cells also appear on the scene, and these coordinate an escalation of the immune response by secreting their own inflammatory molecules, tumor necrosis factor alpha, interferon gamma, and IL-17. Soon after the effector T cells have arrived, a voracious phagocyte called a neutrophil is recruited. Neutrophils are critical for the clearance of bacteria. One weapon in the neutrophil armory is the ability to undergo a dramatic form of self-destruction called netosis. This leaves behind a jumble of DNA saturated with enzymes called a neutrophil extracellular trap. Although this can effectively destroy bacterial invaders and plug any breaches in the epithelial wall, it also causes collateral damage to tissues. Slowly the tide begins to turn and the bacterial invasion is repulsed. Any remaining neutrophils die off via apoptosis, a non-inflammatory form of cell death, and are cleared by macrophages. Epithelial integrity is restored by replacement of any damaged cells with new ones from the intestinal crypts. Finally, Tregs are recruited once again to calm the immune response. Targeting the molecules involved in gut pathology is leading to effective therapies for inflammatory bowel disease.
All right. For now, the digestive system, know where the 4 quadrants are inside the body and what organs are within each. If I were to show you, we're looking down the middle, the midline of the body, and across where the umbilical cord, the umbilicus is, or the belly button. We have the upper right, upper left, lower right, lower left. And the 4 big things to be concerned with in those spots would be upper right, liver, upper left, spleen, lower right, appendix, also the right ovary and the fallopian tube. And on the left side, largely intestinal pains, GI issues, and also the left fallopian tube. So remember, where we get down lower pelvic, lower abdomen, upper pelvis, we have the genitourinary issues to be concerned with. And so always, especially when you're dealing with female patients of sexual active ages or thereabouts, or at least during just, if they are menstruating, there's always a chance for potential pregnancy and ectopic pregnancies, but also ovarian cysts and issues with endometriosis and so forth. So what we then call where the urine is collected and where the body dumps urine and the fluid waste would be the genitourinary system, because it runs so close to the genitals. So the major issues to be concerned with males would and females both would be the kidneys. They are behind the peritoneum. It is called retroperitoneal. As I mentioned, the kidneys sit right about where the floating ribs are, and their main job is to filter the blood. They filter the blood through a pressurized system that will flush the blood through and extract extra fluid if the pressure's too high, as well as electrolytes and waste products. And so if there's too much waste and toxins in the body, the kidneys will be affected. They're highly vascular and they need a constant supply of blood. In cases where shock sets in after an hour, kidneys have been starved of blood long enough to potentially die from that. Even if you bring a patient back from shock, the fact that the kidneys have both died means the patient will die of organ failure. The kidneys drain into the ureters, the excess fluid, mostly the water and albumin, along with electrolytes and waste products, which collect down the ureters into the bladder, and then out the urethra, the waste product goes. Of course, there are muscles that hold all of that together. You activate them by squeezing some and relaxing others. As you get down into the genitals portion of this lecture, males have testes and they have a penis. Testes produce sperm, penis delivers the sperm. The prostate behind the penis is a shifting valve which either opens up for urine or closes for urine and allows semen to be excreted. For females, kidneys, ureters, and the bladder are the same. However, the urethra is much smaller. The muscles around that area are built up a lot more. This is in anticipation of using those muscles for childbirth. But also the fact that the urethra is smaller is oftentimes why females get UTIs much more frequently than males do. Inside the genital system, the female has ovaries, fallopian tubes, which then enter down into the uterus, where if there's a fertilized egg, the baby will start to grow and gestate approximately 9 months or 10 lunar months. And then those same muscles that allow for digestive and urinary excretion are also being incorporated into childbirth. More on that when we get to in utero emergencies and emergency childbirth later in the semester. Okay, realize just how vascular all of this is and how necessary it is if there's any trauma that we're assessing the abdomen and the pelvis for bleeds, for rigidity, for heat, for pulsating masses, or any concern that we may have for ruptured blood vessels or bladders or something of that sort. Lastly, we'll get into skin. It's very interesting if you think about it, but all the outermost layers of our body, including around the lungs, around the digestive system, and skin, it's all dead cells that have been pushed to the surface, having already died. As food or air or whatever comes by it, it's sloughing off those dead cells, and a new crop of cells is eventually coming to the top. This is an electron microscopy image of your different cellular layers of skin. 3 major functions. What does it do? Well, it protects us against the harmful environment. Skin also helps us with temperature regulation, and it does so by allowing for evaporation, sweat, also shunting blood to and from the skin to cool it down or insulate it and keep it warm. And it also transmits information throughout the skin to the brain for processing. Here's a good cross section of the epidermis, largely dead tissue at the end. The epidermis begins here at the germinal layer, where you notice there's blood vessels and a food supply. And so skin cells start to grow here. As they reproduce, another layer starts to grow underneath those, and another layer under those. And therefore, the skin cells, as they mature, move towards the top uppermost layers of the epidermis. As they leave the lower area, they are removed from any blood flow and hence die, so that they are sloughing off as dead cell tissue once they make it to the outermost layers. You have some sweat glands that are producing sweat that allow for evaporation once that fluid makes it to the outside and is hit with wind. We have the old vestigial hairs that could stand up to hold that air in and keep us warm and insulated, which you see in hairier creatures. But for us, it's largely just remaining old hair, much more thin and see-through. If you go down to the bottom of the hair, we have the hair follicles. Down here, there's actually little muscles called erectopili, which still are in charge and will react and cause your hairs to stand on end. And as we go deeper down past this germinal layer, we get into the alive tissue of the skin, the dermis. Here's where you have the blood vessels. This is where you have the active sweat glands, the actual tissues that control the muscles. And this would be, if we're looking at the layers of damage, down below this layer would be any kind of damage to the dermis would cause scarring, would not allow the skin to grow back as actually skin cells. As you go deeper down, there's yet more capillary shunting blood vessels, and then another layer of fascia, followed by adipose tissue. If you were to follow that down any further, that tissue would then be separated off by another layer of fascia, some fluid, and then a layer of fascia covering the superficial muscles of the arm or leg or what you have there. It's a very effective barrier against bacteria and viruses as long as it's not broken. We have to put on gloves just to ensure, even if we do have some breaking or hangnails or some cuts, that we're not exposing ourselves to our patients. And likewise, if we're bleeding, that our patients are receiving anything from us. It allows us to feel touch as well as pressure and pain. So there are sharp receptors versus dull receptors. There are heat receptors, and there are force receptors that feel light and unlight touch as well. And so it's very important to consider all of that stuff. Okay, that's enough for now. For us, that's the human body. What we haven't touched upon is the endocrine system, which we will talk about when we get to blood and endocrine concerns like diabetes and hemophilia, and the lymph, which we barely touch upon, but we should talk about more. Why don't we? I'll tell you, the main concern, I believe, is that there aren't many lymph emergencies. And so as EMTs, we don't spend a lot of time concerning ourselves with any lymphatic issues. Yes, they will cause chronic issues later in life that might cause some issues that become emergencies to us. But by the time those become emergencies to us, they've incorporated the cardiovascular system, the GI system, or the endocrine system. And so we don't worry about lymph nowadays, but we'll see down the line. That's it for now. If you have any questions, let me know. We will talk in class.